$2,000. That's all the balloon costs, the one that just drifted over the Russian front and not a single air defense missile climbs to meet it. Not because the S-400 failed, but because it sees nothing worth firing at. Nothing big hangs beneath this balloon. No missile, no cruise weapon, nothing Russia spent decades building its defenses to stop. Just a small drone dangling patiently from its tail waiting. And over the next few hours, this balloon is going to do something that turns one of the most expensive air defenses on Earth into an open door. The only question is, how do you beat a system that can shoot down anything with something you'd find at a kid's birthday party? To understand why a balloon of all things is making Moscow nervous right now, you have to understand what this war has become in its fourth year, a war of reach. It's no longer just about who holds the front line. It's about who can strike deep behind it, where the fuel is stored, where the ammunition is stacked, where the aircraft refuel. Picture Russia's war machine as a boxer with a very long arm. As long as he can hit you from a distance and you can't reach him, he wins the round without even breaking a sweat. That was Moscow's edge for years. More missiles, more range, more mass. Ukraine stood too close to its enemy with arms too short, so Kyiv did what necessity demanded. If you can't afford expensive cruise missiles by the thousand, you build thousands of cheap drones instead. This war has produced one iron rule: if you can't fight more expensively, fight more cheaply. So cheaply that the enemy goes broke while defending against you. An interceptor missile costs as much as a house. An attack drone costs as much as a used car. A pure decoy drone costs as much as a bicycle, and nobody can keep throwing houses to destroy bicycles forever. Russia knows this math cold. That's why it moved its most valuable targets far to the rear refineries, fuel depots, bomber bases hundreds of kilometers from the front. The logic was simple and reliable for years: whatever is far enough away is safe. A cheap drone only has so much battery, and battery is range. Sooner or later, it drops out of the sky long before it reaches anything that truly matters. That one assumption, far away, means safe, is the wall Ukraine spent years banging its head against, until someone realized you don't have to shoot through that wall at all. You can simply float over it with the wind, because the wind has no range limit. It needs no battery. It costs nothing, makes no sound, and over Ukraine in summer, it blows reliably in a very inconvenient direction from west to east straight into Russia. And as crazy as it sounds, balloons are anything but new to war. Back in the American Civil War, observers went up in tethered balloons to spy over enemy lines. In World War II, Japan sent thousands of fire balloons across the Pacific all the way to North America. The idea is ancient, almost nostalgic. What's new is only what Ukraine hangs underneath it, and that today software calculates the moment of release down to the second. It's a marriage between humanity's oldest flying idea and one of its most modern. And to grasp how big this idea is, one image helps. Draw a circle in your mind around the Ukrainian front. With a normal drone, it reaches maybe 150 kilometers out, to where Russia long ago cleared everything important away. Now take the same pen and draw the circle twice as wide. Suddenly things sit inside it that Moscow believed were untouchable. That second circle was drawn by a piece of latex. And to understand how that's possible, let's look at what the Ukrainians actually tested. Let's start with the hard facts, because this part is well documented. According to BNE IntelliNews and several aviation outlets, Ukraine hung a Ukrainian-American attack drone called the Hornet beneath a simple helium-filled balloon. No technological marvel. A balloon, a hook, a drone dangling upside down from its tail. Then they let go. The balloon rose. Not 100 meters, not 1,000. According to Aerospace Global News, it carried the Hornet to around 8,000 meters, almost the height of Mount Everest. Picture that a small attack drone, silent in the thin freezing air, higher than most airliners fly, held up by a shell that costs less than the smartphone in your pocket. Up there, the hook released. The drone tipped forward and began to glide. And now comes the number this whole story hangs on. When the Hornet landed about 42 kilometers from the launch point, after the test, it still had 95% of its battery. 95%. It had flown 42 kilometers and burned almost nothing. Let that number sink in because it's the heart of the matter. A drone that flies without burning its fuel is no longer a drone with normal range. It's something fundamentally different. Here's the quick translation of why this works. The most expensive stretch in a drone's life isn't the final kilometers, it's the first ones. Down at ground level, the air is thick. A drone taking off and climbing has to fight through that thick air while working against gravity at the same time. That eats energy like a car grinding up a steep hill stuck in first gear. That climb is exactly what drains the battery. The balloon takes that entire ordeal off the drone's shoulders. It carries it up for free into the thin air where there's almost no resistance left. From there, the drone doesn't have to climb anymore. It only has to fall in a long, calm glide like a sailplane lifting off a mountaintop. It needs the motor only at the very end for the last meters to the target. That's why it's at 95%, and that's how a test flight becomes a strategic threat. The Hornet's normal range, according to technical reports, is around 100 to 150 kilometers. With the balloon trick, it stretches to 1.5, even double that. 150 becomes 300. A medium-range weapon turns overnight into a deep strike weapon, and targets Moscow believed were out of reach are suddenly sitting in the fire. And this blow lands on a Russia whose air defense is already bleeding. For months, Ukraine has run a relentless middle strike campaign, its drones knocking out one Russian radar after another in a single month alone. According to Euromaidan Press, the 28th Russian air defense asset was destroyed, including modern systems like the S-35, O, and the Tor. In other words, the net that's supposed to stop the balloon is already springing hole after hole. And the balloon doesn't just exploit those holes, it tears them wider. And if you're thinking that's the real story, a drone now flies 300 kilometers, then you haven't seen the decisive part yet. Because there's a second number buried in this test. Not about altitude, not about range. One about what this drone can carry from now on. And that second number turns a clever trick into a problem Russia's entire air defense doctrine cannot solve. It's the real reason this story won't be forgotten in a month. We'll come back to it. But first, we have to answer the question that holds everything together. Why does Russia's billion-dollar radar wall go suddenly blind against, of all things, a balloon? Let's start with the radar, because that's where the core lies. A modern air defense radar, the kind on an S-400, is a specialist. It was built to find fast, hard, hot things, fighter jets, cruise missiles, ballistic rockets. Anything tearing through the sky with force and metal. A Doppler radar works like an ear that only listens for movement. It measures how fast something is approaching and tunes out everything too slow. Otherwise, it would sound the alarm for every bird and every cloud. Picture a security camera trained to flag running people. Someone strolling by at a leisurely pace doesn't trigger it. He's there. The camera sees him. But it rates him as irrelevant and looks away. That's exactly what a balloon is to these systems. It doesn't race, it drifts along at a few kilometers an hour. It has no motor, so no hot exhaust, plume, and infrared seeker could grab. It has no sharp metal surfaces to bounce a radar beam straight back, just a soft, round shell. To a system built for fast, hot metal, a drifting balloon barely looks like a target worth the trouble. The gap isn't that the radar is broken. The gap is that nobody ever built it to take a helium balloon seriously. And that's not a weakness born of stupidity, it's a weakness born of specialization. The S-400 is brilliant at exactly the job it was built for. It can pick out a fighter jet over hundreds of kilometers and shatter an incoming missile in mid-flight. But every specialization has its price. A sniper trained to hit a tiny target 2 kilometers away is for that very reason the wrong man when 100 party balloons are drifting into your face. Ukraine didn't beat the S-400's weapon. It went around its job description. But now comes the twist that makes this truly uncomfortable. Because Ukraine can play balloons both ways. If it wants to stay invisible, it lets the balloon drift bare and quiet. If it wants the opposite, it hangs small metal reflectors on it, and suddenly that same harmless shell shows up on radar as big as an incoming bomber. Why on earth would you want to be seen because of one simple iron limit? According to Medusa, a system like the S-300 can track only about 65 objects at once. Send 65 balloons, and the 66th thing, the one with the warhead, simply flies through because the radar is already full. And it gets worse. To track the balloons at all, the radar has to switch to active mode. But an active radar practically shouts to the enemy where it's standing. It gives away its own position and turns itself into a target for the next drone. So Russia sits in a trap no matter what it does. Ignore the slow dots and attack drones slip through. Switch on to hunt them and it betrays its valuable positions. And if it actually fires, it spends a missile worth a house on a shell worth a bicycle. And this isn't pure theory. Back in September 2025, according to Medusa, Ukraine sent up a large number of balloons against Russian regions. For the first time, a southwesterly breeze of 12 to 15 kilometers an hour carried them toward Tula Reyes and even Moscow. And Ukrainian military intelligence has long sent hundreds of decoy drones alongside the real warheads purely to overload Russian defenses and bait them into wasting expensive missiles on empty dummies. The balloon carrier is just the logical next step of that idea. First exhaust the defense, then float right over it. Now picture that image at full scale. Not one balloon, not 10, but 100, released on a single day with a strong west wind. Some carry warheads, the rest only reflectors, and no Russian radar screen can tell anymore which dot is lethal and which is just latex. You can't fire $100 million missiles, but you can't just watch either. That swarm is exactly the nightmare the Ukrainians are running the numbers on right now, and it costs them barely more than a few well-timed weather forecasts. Which brings us to the second part of the mechanism, and it's pure math. Russia can shoot down a $2,000 balloon technically no problem at all. One missile up, balloon gone. It just can't afford to do it often enough. If Ukraine sends 10 balloons for the price of a single interceptor missile, Russia loses that exchange with every shot it fires. The real weapon isn't the balloon. The real weapon is the exchange rate between cheap and expensive, and it runs mercilessly against Moscow. There's another bitter irony here. Russia can't even fall back on its own strengths. Send up fighter jets to shoot down balloons. An hour of flight time costs a fortune, and the jet would have to circle around the clock. Hunting latex on the off chance. Electronic jammers. They scramble radio and control signals, but a balloon that simply drifts with the wind listens to no signal you could jam. You can't jam the wind. And laser weapons that would knock something like this out of the sky cheaply, Russia simply doesn't have in any meaningful number. Every familiar answer runs into emptiness. And here the irony turns almost darkly funny. Russia knows the power of balloons by now from its own experience from the other side. When SpaceX cut the Russian military's access to Starlink, in early 2026, Moscow suddenly stood there without its most important data network. The answer, its own balloons. According to reports, Russia now relies on stratospheric balloons of the Barrage 1 type, rising to 20 or 30 kilometers to keep troops and drones connected by radio. So both sides reach for the same ancient technology, except Ukraine turned it into an offensive weapon first, while Russia is still just trying to stay online with it. And now we cash in the promise from earlier, the second number almost everyone overlooked. Remember the 95% battery. Take it one step further. Every attack drone used to carry a brutal compromise inside it. Every gram of battery you add for more range is a gram of explosive you have to leave out. Range against impact. The engineers had to choose fly far or hit hard. You couldn't have both. The balloon simply erases that compromise. When the wind and the altitude deliver the range, the drone no longer needs heavy batteries to travel far. And the weight that frees up that can now be explosive. In other words, the same drone doesn't just fly twice as far, it can also hit far harder at the target. Range and impact rise at the same time for the first time. That's the second number, not the distance, the payload. And this is exactly where it stops being a neat trick and becomes a strategic nightmare for Moscow. A drone that flies farther and carries more explosive forces Russia to push the safety zone around every airfield, every depot, every refinery deeper into its own country. According to reports and assessments, that safety margin would have to grow by around 150 kilometers if the method goes into serial production. That's no longer a tactical annoyance. That's a map that has to be redrawn. That leaves the role of artificial intelligence, because without it, the whole plan would be fragile. A balloon drifts. It doesn't fly with precision. Releasing it at the exactly right moment, over the right point at the right altitude, is a calculation of wind speed, wind direction, and time. That's precisely what software is made for computing the release moment so that the glide that follows actually reaches the target. That is, by all accounts, the AI's first job in this system. The second job is trickier, and here I'll mark openly that we're leaving the ground of confirmed facts. According to the test reports, the Hornet stabilized itself after release and entered the glide on its own. That's documented. The obvious next step, which several observers point to when Russia jams the GPS signal in the target area. And it does that constantly. The drone has to find its target again with its own onboard sensors with no help from satellites. A drone that can do that can't simply be jammed blind anymore. It sees for itself. Whether the Ukrainian Hornet already fully manages that in this exact setup is the part I clearly flag as unconfirmed. But the direction of travel is unmistakable, and maybe the most unsettling part for Moscow. None of this is expensive or exotic. The balloons come from young companies like Aerobavovna, founded only in 2023, which have long been supplying these aerostats to the front as a matter of routine. It takes no new factory, no secret technological leap, no scarce microchips. It takes latex helium, an existing drone, and the right weather forecast. This is the kind of weapon you can't knock out with a single strike because there's nothing central to hit. Let's be clear about one thing: this weapon is no magic wand. A balloon obeys the wind, not the order. If the current turns, the whole load drifts into emptiness or worse, back over your own territory. The method works only on days when the weather plays along, and that's exactly why in the end everything hangs on one single, often underrated skill. Not the drone, not the balloon, the forecast. Whoever can read the wind best wins this game. And that leads straight to the question hanging over all of it. What happens when Ukraine learns to time the wind at scale? So what does this mean for the months ahead? Let's soberly play out three paths instead of just claiming the most dramatic ending. First path, the whole thing stays a footnote. Maybe it proves too unreliable at scale, the wind turns the balloons drift the wrong way, only a fraction hit. A clever stunt, then good for a few spectacular strikes, but not enough to move the war. Second path, Russia finds a cheap answer. Maybe Moscow mass produces simple interceptor drones that climb up and pop balloons for a few $100s instead of wasting $1 million missiles. Then the cost advantage evaporates and the arms race rolls into its next round. Third path, and here's where I place my bet. I think the most likely scenario is that Ukraine scales the method and puts it into serial production, and for one very human reason, it's too cheap not to use. The side under economic pressure without expensive cruise missiles to spare is not going to leave a weapon that costs almost nothing and reaches deep into Russia's rear, sitting unused in a drawer. The entire logic of this war, cheap beats expensive points exactly this way. If I'm right in the coming months, we won't see a single spectacle, but a pattern strikes on Russian refineries and depots that suddenly lie deeper inland than anyone thought possible, clustered in the weeks when the wind is favorable. Remember, Russia's oil industry is already being ground down with 10 to 15% of its refining capacity periodically offline, according to reports. The balloon is the lever that makes that campaign deeper and cheaper. Watch for 3 concrete signs that tell you whether I'm right. First, strike reports from Russian regions that used to count as too deep hundreds of kilometers behind the line. Second, a striking pattern where these attacks cluster on days with a west wind. And third, Russian voices starting to complain about balloons instead of missiles that would be the admission that the trick works. If those 3 signs show up together, the experiment has become a doctrine. And it won't stop with Ukraine. Europe has already had a taste. Lithuania has had to close its airspace more than once because simple balloons drifted over from Belarus, at first carrying nothing but smuggled cigarettes. If a piece of latex can shut down an entire airport, then this is no longer a Ukrainian specialty. It's a lesson every army in the world is taking notes on right now. But every honest prediction needs a ripcord the condition under which I'm wrong. Here's mine if Russia within the next few months stands up a genuinely cheap, scalable defense against slow, high-altitude objects, swarms of its own interceptor drones that hunt balloons for small money, then the math flips and the whole advantage melts away. So don't watch the next headline about a burning fuel tank. Watch whether Russia starts hitting back cheaply. That's the real gauge. Let's pause for a second because this is bigger than a single balloon. For centuries in warfare, the more expensive side almost always won, the more complex, the technologically superior. This story points to something else, an age in which the cheap the patient, the almost primitive forces the expensive machine to its knees simply because it has the math on its side. One great power can exhaust another in an arms race. But how do you exhaust an enemy whose sharpest weapon costs as much as a children's toy and is powered by the weather? If my bet pays off, you'll know it by one quiet sign: Russian targets burning, even though they sit far too deep to be hit and always when the wind blows east. Keep your eye on the wind. It just became a weapon. Maybe that's the real lesson of this war. It's not the side with the most expensive weapons that wins, but the one that rethinks fastest. While one side pours billions into ever more complex systems, the other hangs a drone under a balloon and lets the sky do the work. Which of those 2 ways of thinking wins out in the end will decide far more than the fate of a single refinery. So if this is the kind of breakdown you want the mechanics beneath the headline, not the noise on top of it, share it with someone who needs to see it and subscribe so you never miss the next one.